I begin with a quotation from Gian Jacopo Trivulzio, who was a commendatore in actually the French military, despite his name, in the late 15th century. He's famous for saying that to wage war, three things are necessary: money, money, and more money. In fact, no state ever won a war without money or arms. The challenge of acquiring sufficient resources to fight is especially acute for rebels, revolutionaries, and guerrillas, who enter armed struggle at a comparative disadvantage to the states or the regimes they strive to overthrow. In order to acquire weaponry and supplies, anti-regime actors have a limited number of options. They can steal from the police or the military of their sovereign. They can appeal for aid from sympathetic states or their ethnic kinsfolk in other lands. They can extract revenues and resources from their own population, or they can develop homegrown arms production. Scholars of Israel in 1948 compare it mainly to its Arab foes, presenting the war as a struggle between a state in the making and an array of sovereign states. They have not engaged in global or diachronic comparisons, nor have they seriously considered Israel as an element in the matrix of state-seeking movements of the interwar and post-war periods. Now, Israel's struggle for statehood does not fit neatly into a comparison with anti-colonial movements in the 20th century, in that the colonial power, Britain, in 1917 officially pledged to promote the Zionist cause, and did so with only occasional lapses until 1939. What's more, while the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, waged a guerrilla war against the British after World War II, the principal target of fighting in 1948 was Palestine's native Arab majority and the Arab states that claimed to be protecting the Palestinians. Situationally, though, the Yishuv resembled anti-colonial movements of the time in that it strove for independence, and it rapidly developed autonomous political and military institutions, even when under considerable duress. And in all these cases, around the world at the time, success or failure depended upon the ability to raise funds and to acquire weapons. In some ways, Israel in 1948 was far more poorly positioned to gain international financial support than other state-seeking movements in the era of decolonization. In other ways, it was superior. In 1948, Israel did not receive aid from foreign states, but it had well-developed mechanisms of taxation and marketing public debt. No less important, Jews in the diaspora purchased weaponry, provisioned the armed forces, and augmented them with experienced and technically expert personnel, and sustained the civilian economy of the fledgling Israeli state. Money and men, financial and human capital, were inseparable components of the diaspora's contributions to Israel's struggle for existence. Now, in the first part of the paper, which will not be about Israel, I'm going to construct a typology of funding and arms acquisition schemes by state-seeking actors in the early to mid-20th century. My comparison situations are Ireland during the Anglo-Irish and Irish Civil War, Algeria during its guerrilla war against France, Vietnam during the First Indo-Chinese War, and Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising 1952 to 1956. Cases from four distinct regions of the globe: Northern Europe, Northern Africa, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, sharing common traits as sites of anti-colonial struggles in which the colonized suffered from a severe material disadvantage at the onset of hostilities. The guerrillas' first tactic was to scrounge for weapons within their communities and to steal them from the police or military of the colonizing power. In the early days of the Algerian War, the ALN, the Armée de Libération Nationale, was so short of weaponry that at times it had to make do with hunting rifles and knives. In Kenya, urban Kikuyu civilians employed by the government at police stations, prisons, and railway yards had abundant opportunities to pilfer weapons and supplies, which they then passed on to the guerrillas. In Nairobi, prostitutes sympathetic with the rebel cause demanded bullets in payment for their services. Such heroic gestures could not generate the kind of resources required to overthrow a deeply rooted colonial regime. In Kenya, the Mau Mau's small arms were no match for the British military, which crushed the rebels via armor and air power. The eventual British withdrawal from Kenya was less a direct response to the Mau Mau than an acknowledgement of the unsustainability of a colonial presence in Kenya or pretty much anywhere else in the world. The French authorities and the Pieds Noirs, the European settlers in Algeria, however, were less willing to sacrifice a territory that since 1848 had been considered an integral part of France, not a colony. In order to drive the French out, the Algerian nationalists depended upon foreign aid. Foreign aid is now our second source of material support for anti-regime actors. In 1958, the Arab League pledged $34 million to the Algerian resistance movement's political arm, the FLN. It's not clear how much of that money ever materialized. It's one thing to pledge money, it's another thing to actually get it, as anyone who's ever done Jewish fundraising can tell you. But towards the end of the war, China contributed substantial sums. China's communists themselves had, during their years of struggle against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, benefited from Soviet financial assistance and weapons that the USSR had taken after World War II from the Japanese. During the 1950s, Czechoslovakia was a conduit for small arms for the ALM, just as it had provided weaponry to Israel in 1948. In both cases, they acted with the USSR's express approval. Foreign aid to the Algerian rebels could also take the form of logistical support. During its first years, the ALN needed Egyptian help in running the camel caravans that transported arms across the Sahara and engaged it in a constant cat-and-mouse game with French forces in Algeria and Tunisia. Vietnam provides an especially useful example of the many different forms that foreign assistance could take. From its post-war beginnings, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the DRV, received military stock from the Soviet Union, but to a much greater extent from China. Between April and September of 1950, China supplied the Viet Minh with 14,000 handguns, 17,000 machine guns, 150 cannon, and almost 3,000 tons of grain, plus ammunition, arms manufacturing machinery, medicine, and medical equipment. Aid levels grew even greater after the end of the Korean War in 1953. China also was Vietnam's most important trading partner, with commerce handled via the DRV's Bureau of Foreign Commerce. In May of 1947 alone, the Bureau purchased over 25 million won worth of supplies ranging from uniforms, petrol, radio equipment, and medicine to small arms and explosives. This trade took place in a gray zone between the black and the free markets. Some of it was contraband, and the transactions had a strong governmental imprimatur. Last and not least, China enhanced the Viet Minh's human capital. China's celebrated Huangpu Military Academy, which had been built in the 1920s with Soviet assistance, authorized Ho Chi Minh to send dozens of Viet Minh cadres to China for training in Soviet military science. In April of 1950, the DRV's defense ministry transferred its own Trong Quoc Tuan Military Academy to southern China, where 30,000 Viet Minh were transformed from undisciplined guerrillas into soldiers and officers, familiar with command structure, large-scale operations, and strategic planning. This direct intervention by a powerful state into the operations of a guerrilla force differed in intent, but not in ultimate benefit, from the case of ALN leaders who had fought for France, or the 30,000 Jewish residents of Palestine who had served the British forces in World War II. The more thoroughly anti-regime actors have been trained in military operations, the more likely their movements are to succeed, even if it means overthrowing those who trained them. In most cases, state aid has overpowered the third type of assistance I'm going to analyze: contributions from diaspora communities sympathetic with the anti-regime actors' cause. During the 1950s, the eastern Thai provinces were home to some 50,000 ethnic Vietnamese who rarely donated money. They did facilitate trade with the DRV, and they arranged for the transportation of some purchased items. This was a profitable business for the ethnic Vietnamese, and it really can't be considered a form of ethnic or nationalist philanthropy. Although some diaspora Vietnamese did volunteer their time to provide translation and administrative services for the Viet Minh. Given the extent of Russian and Chinese aid to the Viet Minh, the role of diaspora aid was modest and of little consequence. But the situation is very different for the rebels in Algeria. In addition to support from China, Czechoslovakia, and the Arab states, a significant smuggling network operated out of France. Between 1957 and 1960, this network, led by the journalist Francis Janson, as he's at least pronounced in English, smuggled money, forged identification documents, and small arms into Algeria. The donations came primarily not from the Algerian diaspora, but from a wide spectrum of French sympathizers of the FLN. The sums raised were considerable, amounting to perhaps 12 million American dollars in a single year. Now, our own era is filled with ethnic diasporas funneling money to separatist and liberation movements in the homeland. To provide but one example from my own second country, Tamil Canadians have had a long and checkered history of financial support for the Tamil Tigers prior to their decisive defeat by the Sri Lankan government in 2009. The significance of diaspora aid, though, can be questionable. During the 1970s and 80s, Irish Americans vigorously solicited funds for the organization known as Northern Aid, NORAID, allegedly for families of incarcerated or killed IRA fighters, although the money was in fact used for the purchase of arms and explosives. The total amount raised over this period was about $3.6 million, a minuscule sum when compared with the IRA's annual income of about $10 million, most of which came from criminal activities such as bank robberies, extortion, and kidnapping, as well as a network of legitimate small business. During Ireland's struggle for independence earlier in the 20th century, the Irish diaspora in North America had been a significant source of philanthropic aid. The American Committee for Relief in Ireland raised over $5 million to feed, clothe, and house Irish civilians between 1920 and 22. It's far less clear, though, how much Irish Americans donated to arms smuggling operations in the US, or how important the smuggled weapons really were in Ireland's struggle for independence. The American-made Thompson submachine gun that went on the market in 1921 has acquired a legendary status in Irish collective memory, but in fact very few of the guns were sent to Ireland during the time of the Anglo-Irish War. The Irish White Cross chartered a ship to carry a load of 500 Thompsons disguised in sacks labeled leg of lamb, but the contraband was found before departure from New York. Joseph McGarrity, a major fundraiser for the IRA in New York, managed to send a few score Thompsons to Ireland during the 1930s, long after the country had achieved independence. In addition to being thin on the ground, the guns were inaccurate, unusable beyond a range of a few hundred yards, and often unreliable. Now, as the provisional IRA of the 1970s shows, crime can pay well. So well that the IRA was able to purchase vast quantities of arms, first on the private market in the United States, and then from the Libyan government. In most cases, however, successful anti-state actors have invested less effort in crime than in developing predictable, routinized flows of income and materiel from their own populace. So this is now the fourth, and I think in some ways normally the most important criterion or way that these state-seeking movements can obtain the resources they need via access to taxation revenue, credit, raw materials, and manufactured goods. The process by which these products were collected could at times be extortionate and coercive, as in the Soviet Union under war communism, the brutal economic regime of enforced food requisitioning during the civil wars of 1918 to 22. A quarter century later, Maoist rebels in China combined the carrot with the stick, destroying the old rural elite and winning the support of the peasantry through land reform. A newly empowered peasantry took on the tasks of tax collecting and organizing the flow of money, food, and supplies to the PLA, People's Liberation Army. For the FLN in Algeria, during the tough years before foreign aid started to arrive in 1958, the key to survival lay in developing regional authorities with powers of taxation. Now, the FLN was an elite revolutionary movement to which most of Algeria's Muslims did not belong, but they supported it as the most effective and likely means to shake off French domination and that of the Pieds Noirs. There was no separation between government and party. Dues-paying members to the FLN provided a secondary stream of revenue for guerrilla activity. Collected funds were deposited in local banks and then transferred to the bank's branches abroad, where they were used to purchase weapons and supplies. Ironically, the Algerian revolutionaries benefited from Algeria's political status as an integral part of France, in that Algeria used the French franc, a major, widely accepted world currency. Arms merchants in any country would be happy to take francs, although the cost of weapons rose consistently due to the inflation that throughout the 1950s steadily eroded the franc's purchasing power, so much so that by 1960 the new franc replaced the old at a value of 100 to 1. Now, a corollary to independent taxation authority is the ability to manufacture one's own weapons. Large-scale arms production, however, has not been common among anti-regime actors in the last century. As we saw, the IRA, we didn't see because I didn't mention it earlier, sorry, the IRA ceased munitions manufacture in mid-1921. Mau Mau blacksmiths manufactured pistols and rifles, but they were notoriously unreliable. The Viet Minh, however, did produce a vast quantity and of fairly good quality weaponry, about 7,000 tons of grenades, bazookas, bombs, and other small arms. Now, I've been talking for about 15 minutes, and I've barely mentioned Israel. So you might say, why have I been saying all these things? Because I've been trying to create, through a kind of a tour d'horizon, of the realm of anti-regime activity in the era of post-World War II, or in the case of the Irish post-World War I, decolonization, a kind of framework of how these movements operate, so then we can see where the Zionists do and do not fit in. We've seen that no one type or combination of funding and acquisition mechanism assured success. The most important variable, the military capacity, determination, and ruthlessness of those they were fighting against, was out of the rebels' hands. Historically, the most significant source of money and munitions was aid from patron states, and in 1948, the Zionists had no patron. Czech arms sales to Israel in 1948 could not have taken place without Soviet authorization, but these were cash transactions. They were not gifts. The Zionists had to either buy weapons or make their own, nor could the Zionists hope to get very far with small arms, whether acquired by theft, gift, or purchase. Guerrilla warfare waged with handguns and explosives had sufficed to drive the British out of Palestine, just as similar tactics had worked for the Irish Republicans during the Anglo-Irish War. Both the Irish and Israeli wars of independence followed shortly upon world wars that exhausted and financially strained the British government. Both wars were the final chapters of independence movements in which Britain had been enmeshed for decades. Home rule, going back to the 1870s, Zionism to 1917. The British were not willing, and this is an important point, to apply the level of force to the Irish or to the Jews that they had unleashed upon, say, the Mau Mau in the mid-1950s. The Black and Tans and the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary terrorized the Irish population, but their crimes were dwarfed by British actions in Kenya, the use of bomber aircraft, massacres or executions of thousands, construction of labor camps for political prisoners, and forced resettlement of 1 million Kikuyu in villages surrounded by barbed wire and deep trenches, in short, concentration camps. The British suppression of the 1936 to 39 Palestinian revolt had many of these features. In contrast, British activities against the Zionist militias appear tame, even when taking into account the 12 Irgun and Lehi guerrillas who were executed by the British or who committed suicide in prison in order to cheat the hangman. Now, compared with the successful guerrilla movements we've been looking at, Algeria, Vietnam, the Palestinian militias who fought against the Zionists in 1947 and 48 were not a formidable foe. Over the course of the Mandate period, the Palestinians were riven by factional and ideological rivalries, and they failed to develop a hegemonic revolutionary organization with proto-governmental qualities. During the Arab Revolt of the 1930s, the British killed or deported many of the rebellion's leaders and captured much of their weaponry. Internecine warfare amongst Palestinian factions reduced the leadership even more. In 1947-48, the primary Palestinian militia, the Holy War Army, numbered fewer than 10,000 fighters, most of whom were untrained, inexperienced, and poorly equipped. The Arab Liberation Army, a volunteer force assembled under the authority of the Arab League, had able leaders, but a small force of perhaps 5,000, whose main function was to protect Syria from the expansionist ambitions of King Abdullah of Jordan. The Arab states strove more to throttle than to nurture autonomous Palestinian military force. And yet, despite their small numbers and limited firepower, the Palestinians enjoyed important tactical advantages over the Jews in the late fall of 1947 and in the winter of 1948. Jews controlled less than 10% of Palestine's territory, and they were outnumbered 2-1. Palestinian fighters could travel with ease throughout the countryside, taking shelter in hundreds of Arab villages, whether the village folk wanted them there or not. Jewish agricultural settlements were highly vulnerable to attack, as was the road to West Jerusalem, which was virtually impassable due to Palestinian sniper fire. In order to break the siege of Jerusalem and defend the Jewish rural settlements, and even more so, in order to push back the Arab states that attacked in May of 1948, the Zionists required transport vehicles, artillery, armor, and aircraft, in addition to massive quantities of small arms. The Yishuv marshaled the necessary resources to provision its troops and to maintain its civilian economy via the public institutions it developed throughout the period of the Mandate. As soon as it was born, Israel assumed the responsibilities of a full-grown state, but it would have died in the cradle without a foreign patron. As no state came forward, the diaspora took its place, and to an extent unrivaled in the history of the 20th century. Fighting the 1948 war was a far more expensive affair for Israel than for the Arab states that attacked it. The Arab states deployed only portions of their armies, and with the exception of brief fighting in the Sinai, the war was carried out entirely on the soil of the lands designated for the Jewish and the Palestinian states. Nonetheless, Jordan and Iraq were plummeted into financial crisis by the war, a crisis Israel avoided by mobilizing its entire population and economy in what one scholar has called a state of total war. Israel extracted almost 3/4 of the $300 million direct cost of the war from its own citizens, by loans subscribed by patriotic individuals, especially the Yishuv's small business class, taxes, and bonds bought by patriotic and desperate banks. Since Israel's very survival was far from certain, the purchase of government debt was an expression of fervent patriotism, collective solidarity, and desperate hope. Even the robust civic spirit of the Israeli population, however, could not compensate for the exclusion of the Palestine pound from the sterling bloc in February of 1948, which rendered the Israeli currency non-convertible and essentially useless for the payment of foreign trade. Israel was thus more poorly positioned to purchase arms than guerrilla movements operating within the penumbra of a colonizing power's currency. For Algeria, as I said, the French franc. For Ireland, the British pound. The final and crucial quarter of the cost of Israel's war of independence had to come in the form of hard currency. And that had to be supplied by diaspora Jewry. In addition to raising funds, diaspora Jews worked closely with Zionist emissaries, mainly from the Haganah, in the acquisition of arms both before and during the war. Despite the many challenges facing Israel in 1948 with respect to arms purchase, its situation was actually superior to that of Arab states, which did not have arms acquisition networks abroad. Before the war, Arab states had been able to buy substantial quantities of high-quality, heavy weaponry from the United Kingdom and other countries, but they were denied access to these weapons after the imposition of embargoes on arms sales, first by the United States in December of 1947, strengthened by executive order in April of 1948, and then by the United Nations in May of 1948. Now, the story of diaspora Jewish military assistance to Israel predates the state's creation by 3 years. On the 1st of July, 1945, United Jewish Appeal Director Henry Monter convened a meeting at the New York home of industrialist Rudolf Sonneborn. The meeting was attended by 17 prominent Jewish businessmen and Zionist activists. The guest speaker at the meeting was David Ben-Gurion, who told the gathered guests that Great Britain would leave Palestine within 3 years, and that the Jews of Palestine would have to fight a war against the Arab states. He called upon those assembled to create an organization to raise funds and provide the fledgling Jewish state with weaponry. All present at the meeting agreed to take part in this largely illegal enterprise, being illegal to transport, it was legal to transport civilian military goods abroad, but not weaponry, particularly if it might be used against a foreign ally, that is, the United Kingdom. The meeting resulted in the creation of a steering committee that established what became known as the Sonneborn Institute. Now, this meeting has become the stuff of legend. Memoir accounts differ widely as to the composition of the meeting, as well as its participants' later activities. Late arrivals to what became known as the Sonneborn Institute depict themselves as present from the beginning, and peripheral characters claim to have played a major role. It's a bit like people on the Mayflower, or how many pallbearers there were at Herzl's funeral. There's also a confusion about the Institute's illegal activities, such as raising funds to acquire arms production machinery and smuggle it abroad, and the legal collection that they engaged in. They raised money to buy tents and clothing and things like that. Now, fortunately, despite the secrecy attached to the meeting, an archival document with the guest list has survived. And from that list, we have a kind of point of departure for exploring what kind of prominent American Jews were willing to commit themselves to break the law to assist in the establishment of a Jewish state. Most of the men present, they were all men, had been deeply involved in Zionist affairs. Some were modestly successful attorneys or businessmen, like Atlanta's Howard Travis, president of the Zionist Organization of America's Southeastern Region and the founder of Camp Judea in North Carolina. There was Cleveland's Ezra Shapiro, later to become world chairman of Keren HaYesod United Israel Appeal. 11 of the 17 were highly affluent, and several had penetrated American elite society. Sonneborn himself was old money, the grandson of an immigrant who became a prosperous textile manufacturer. Like his father, Rudolf Sonneborn attended the prestigious Johns Hopkins University, and once in business, he turned his family concerns successfully from textiles to petrochemicals. He also married into the German Jewish aristocracy, being the fourth husband of Dorothy Schiff, the granddaughter of financier Jacob Schiff. Charles Rosenblum, son of an immigrant Jew from Lithuania who became a liquor distributor in Pittsburgh, attended Yale, became an attorney, and then went into business with his college friend Alex Lowenthal, who was also at the meeting. Lowenthal was a land developer and a pillar of Pittsburgh's civic affairs, amassing sufficient wealth to retire at the age of 50. Rosenblum was at least as successful as a financier and developer and became a trustee of Carnegie Mellon University, to which he donated masterpieces of European art from his private collection, and also to the Yale University Library. The shoe magnate Philip Lohm, best known today for his endowments to Brandeis University, was an immigrant from Lithuania and yet a college graduate from the University of Maine, who had worked in the Army's Chemical Warfare Service during World War I. William Silk owned a chain of drugstores in Philadelphia, and Julius Fliegelman was a wealthy furniture manufacturer from my hometown of Los Angeles. These men were, as a whole, not only well-to-do, but by the standards of the mid-20th century American immigrant Jewish community, reasonably genteel. Now, one of the most active members of the group, Shepard Broad, had been born into poverty in Pinsk and clambered his way to great success as a banker, lawyer, and real estate developer in Miami. Broad had a reputation as a tough and savvy businessman who was not unaccustomed to skirting the edge of the law, but he was also a pillar of the Miami business and philanthropic community. Although the men of the Sonneborn group were mostly of East European origin, and several were first-generation immigrants, they were all respected figures within a variety of communities outside the Jewish realm in which they would have been unlikely to flout the law in any serious way. Now, the Sonneborn group created a bourgeois underground, replete with decentralized cells, safe houses, and nom de guerre. Some of the group's leaders had been involved in weapons production and supply during the Second World War, and they hired a staff of technical experts to locate surplus army machinery for manufacturing guns and bullets. Zionist youth volunteered to package munitions in deceptively marked crates. Respected lawyers rented warehouse spaces for the production of weapons and stored vast amounts of cash in their office safes. With much of American trucking in Jewish hands, many of the American wholesale trucking lines were owned by Jews. Many of the truck line owners themselves were supportive of the Sonneborn project, and so legal goods like tents and foodstuffs, as well as illegal material, was transported from New York onto Palestine, or to New York, from various parts of the US and then to Palestine. Now, the Sonneborn Institute resembles in many ways the Jeanson network that I referred to earlier, the one in France on behalf of the FLM. But it mobilized more people and it raised more money. The Jeanson network had some 40 full-time mules and a supply network of hundreds. But through word of mouth, the Sonneborn Institute grew to several thousand, with professional connections to key industries like textiles, naval surplus, and telecommunications for radio transmitters and walkie-talkies, 10,000 of which were later smuggled to Palestine. Sonneborn created a permanent administrative structure with a finance department headed by stockbroker Louis Rocker. Within the first months of 1947, the group raised only about $500,000, but it purchased 2 Canadian corvettes and a freighter, the President Warfield, later to be rechristened Exodus 1947. By the end of 1947, $2 million had come in. By 1948, total fundraising was about $7 million, with several million more having come in through the Haganah's own arms requisitioning or acquisition operations that were running in the United States at about the same time. This money went to the acquisition of ships for illegal immigration, airplanes, especially transport craft, and most important, and what really I would emphasize, equipment for arms manufacture. 70% of the machinery used by Israel to manufacture small arms and munitions was bought in the United States through these mechanisms. Now, I mentioned the Haganah's acquisition activities between 1945 and 1948, headed by the likes of Yaakov Dori, Shlomo Shamir, and Teddy Kollek, later well known as the long-serving mayor of Jerusalem. But the Haganah's operations were dependent upon American Jewish activists. So, for example, Chaim Slavin, who headed up arms machinery purchases until the end of 1946, knew a lot about engineering from having worked for the Palestine Electric Company, but he knew nothing about North America, and he could not speak English. He taught himself English evidently by reading the collected stories of Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which he carried in his pocket in the streets of Manhattan. One can imagine his conversations with bemused apothecaries. Slavin thus needed Harry Levine, a millionaire plastics manufacturer from Massachusetts with extensive wartime experience in arms manufacture. Levine made connections with arms merchants throughout the United States and rented a warehouse in the Bronx to house contraband. He also rented factory space in downtown Toronto, where Slavin and Carl Ekdal, a Swedish arms expert, created a prototype machine gun. Now, at times, it was simply impossible to tell if an initiative originated from a Palestinian Jew or an American Jew, or is something of an interaction between them. Particularly true if we look beyond the philanthropic elite in the Sonneborn group to the scores of American experts who assisted the Haganah's acquisition operations. So, for example, Haganah leaders in Palestine were from the start enthusiastic about the import of machinery for manufacturing light arms. But until late 1947, they were reluctant to think in terms of a multi-state Arab invasion and the need for air power for ground troop support or transport. The idea of buying airplanes came from the US, most likely from Al Schwimmer, a former TWA navigator who founded a shell company called Service Airlines, which purchased aircraft and then flew them to Palestine. Schwimmer also directed the recruiting of American airmen, rendering his contribution to the war all the more essential. Now, with the American arms embargo in place and firm restrictions on foreign involvement in arms purchase and transfer, American Jews assumed most of the legal responsibility for the acquisition project, reasoning that if they were caught, the consequences would be less grave than for Palestinian Jews. And in fact, on several occasions, the Americans, like the Irish Republicans in the early 1920s, were caught red-handed. Crates filled with dynamite spilled open on a New York dock. Royal Canadian Mounted Police at Niagara Falls apprehended the prototype submachine gun being smuggled from Toronto. What happened was the Haganah emissaries would always go, a young man and a young woman. They would disguise themselves as newlyweds, decorate the car with ribbons and cans and the like, and they figured this way they wouldn't be searched. Evidently, there was a time where they were stopped at the border by the Mounties, and I guess the Haganah, the male said, like, kind of in a nervy sort of way, said, "Go ahead and search the car if you want." So he searched the car. They found the prototype submachine gun. And yet, and often, quite often, volunteer pilots were apprehended while trying to fly planes from the US to Europe. There were also cases where the planes blew up, and it was a very dangerous enterprise. But out of all of these incidents where people were caught, only one participant went to jail. Al Schwimmer was convicted of conspiracy, fined heavily, and stripped of his civil rights. He was pardoned by President Clinton in 2001. Many others received suspended sentences or fines, at times nominal. Now, why? In the United States, the courts were in general sympathetic to the Zionist cause. The defendants had astute legal representation, and the FBI was never able to pierce beyond one local cell and expose the national operation in its entirety. Apparently, it didn't try very hard. Once FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had ascertained that the weapons would not be used within the United States. In contrast, France in 1960 had an enraged and fearful government, which was bogged down in the Algerian War and put 25 activists in the Jeanson network on trial, 16 of whom received stiff jail sentences. Now, the American Jews involved in the Sonneborn Project did not know in advance whether or not they'd be prosecuted. They were aware of the possible repercussions, but they felt morally compelled to act as they did. They saw themselves as leaders of an American Jewish home front, an extension of the massive home front campaign of the recently concluded Second World War. There's also an obvious parallel to the Irish Americans, who funneled money and arms, or funneled money and some arms in smaller amounts, to the Irish Republican Army during the Anglo-Irish and Irish Civil Wars. Irish and Jewish Americans also shared a self-perception as historic victims and of the national struggle as a righting of ancient wrongs. Al Robeson, a textile merchant from New Jersey, and one of the major figures behind the Sonneborn Project, described it this way, quote, "Here was an opportunity that happened maybe once in a lifetime, and maybe not even then. That we could be cloak and dagger people, that we could live dangerously and feel highly virtuous about it, that we could actually make history." Another member of the group expressed his feelings even more viscerally. "Haganah, it's the biggest romance. It's the greatest thing certain Jews have had happen to them in this country. I've known Jews all my life who were waiting for the day they could point to another Jew who carried a gun and say, 'That man, he represents me.' Meaning, not a gangster, but a hero. And in the last few weeks, the papers have come forth and they mention Haganah with respect." The Sonneborn Group's activities were curtailed by secrecy, competition with public Zionist fundraising, and the lack of tax-deductible status for donations. Much of the arms and equipment purchased in the U.S. was confiscated by the authorities, lost or pilfered en route, or arrived too late to be of use, such as fighter aircraft, as opposed to transport planes. Transport planes played a much more important role in the Air Force in 1948 than fighter aircraft. But the network of Jewish businessmen and Haganah agents certainly accomplished more than its counterparts, say, in the revisionist militia Etzel, who managed to bring in only several $100,000. The businessmen were also more generous and effective than the Jewish gangsters, whose donations, both in cash and in kind, are the subject of many tales of dubious accuracy. There's a whole genre of stories about gangsters on La Cienega Boulevard in Beverly Hills and Los Angeles circulating bags and cash. But, I've read all this stuff, you add it up, and even if you accept at face value these stories, which are, of course, highly suspect, it's not that much money, a few $100,000. What's more, Jewish gangsters did not always display a sentimental attachment to Israel. In 1951, two Detroit Jews, Arthur Liebob and Sam Stein, were convicted of trying to smuggle 21 U.S. warplanes from Newark to Egypt during the 1948 war. But all of this story, the Sonneborn Institute, the safe houses, the smuggling, is a colorful story. It's an interesting one, and it did have some real financial benefit to Israel in 1948. But it pales in comparison with the massive United Jewish Appeal fundraising drive of 1948. It is really here that the Jewish diaspora's financial contributions to Israel diverged most drastically from other cases of diaspora assistance to the homeland battle. In 1948, the UJA set itself an astronomical figure of $250 million for its annual goal. Now, the campaign did reach $150 million, which exceeded previous years' tallies by 5 or even tenfold. In previous years, 20 to 35% of the campaign receipts were allocated to the United Palestine Appeal. But in 1948, the UPA received almost half, about $70 million, of which $41 million was dedicated specifically to arms purchase for Israel. Another $15 million came from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which went to civilian needs to Israel, and millions more, and I have a hard time establishing it, but I do have a list of every single American Jewish organization in 1948, and the amount of money is $100,000 here and $50,000 there. It adds up quite a bit. The UJA's tally alone was 4 times greater than the American Red Cross's entire American campaign, and 12 times greater than that of the American Cancer Society. The campaign's success was at least in part the product of Golda Meir's charismatic speech-making and negotiations with the UJA over the percentage of receipts to be allocated to the Jewish Agency for general and especially for arms purchase use. Golda Meir helped whip up a veritable frenzy of Jewish giving to Zionist causes, which one historian has estimated amounted to approximately 2.5% of American Jewry's aggregate net disposable income. Total arms sales, arms costs for Israel in 1948 were $78 million. Between the funds raised in the United States and another 15 million or more raised in Europe, 86% of the cost of Israel's arms purchased in 1948 was borne by foreign sources. These funds paid for heavy arms and equipment purchased in France, Italy, and eventually Czechoslovakia. For some reason, the Czech arms deal has enormous resonance in Jewish public memory, but there was an equally important one earlier in 1948 from France and Italy, and it was this earlier purchase that allowed the Israeli forces to withstand the first Arab assaults of May and June of that year. The funds also paid for more modest purchases, such as machinery for the manufacture of small arms, as I've said, and munitions, which proved to be of immense benefit to Israel. Since the Arab states began the war, this is a very important point, the Arab states did begin the war with superior weaponry. They had more of it, and it was better. But they soon ran out of spare parts. And even more important, they ran out of bullets. They ran out of ammunition. And I've given this talk before, and often there's veterans in the audience. There were veterans from World War II, particularly from the desert campaigns. I've talked with veterans from other conflicts, including the Israeli army. And I have heard many of them confirm this, that once weaponry begins to be operated under battlefield conditions, it jams, it breaks, it needs to be repaired. You have to have replacement parts, and of course you have to have ammunition. While Jewish businessmen were doing their utmost to smuggle materiel into Palestine, some 3,500 volunteer fighters, known as Machal, came into the country to take part in the war. National liberation struggles frequently attract sympathetic volunteers, as well as mercenaries and serial soldiers, men who go from one conflict to the next in order to experience the thrill of battle. There were some mercenaries among the Machal, particularly Gentile pilots, who were paid pretty well, about $500 a month. But the vast majority of the Machal were truly volunteers. They received only a token wage. They hailed mainly from the US, Canada, and South Africa, but volunteers came as well from North Africa. The South African and North American men of the Machal forces supplied the bulk of the pilots and crew for Israel's embryonic air force, which, as I mentioned earlier, was very important as a transport force. More important than as a combat force, although there were some important incidents. Machal forces were also highly overrepresented in Israel's embryonic navy, commanded by Paul Schulman, the first commander, an Annapolis graduate who received his appointment at the age of 26. Machal commanders served in ground units as well as in the 8th Armored Brigade, which had an English-speaking heavy tank company. Benjamin Dunkelman, a major in the Canadian forces in World War II, commanded the 7th Brigade in the Lower Galilee, and 2 of his battalion commanders, Joe Wiener and Baruch Friedman Erez, were volunteers. The most celebrated Machal ground commander was Mickey Marcus, a West Point graduate who served with distinction in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters in World War II. As a volunteer in the newly formed Israel Defense Force, Marcus commanded the Jerusalem front with the rank of Major General before he was mistakenly killed by a Palmach sentry at Abu Ghosh on 10 June 1948. Despite the highly sympathetic stance towards the Zionist project taken by all major Jewish organizations during the war, American Jewish volunteer rates for the Machal were only a fraction of those from other countries. 1 in 5,000 American Jews volunteered. The ratios were 1 in 1,000 for Canada, 1 in 500 for Britain, and a stunning 1% for South Africa, even higher if one takes into account the streams of South African Jewish youth who volunteered but were not mobilized. The United States sent more American Jews to the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War than to Palestine in 1948. Why was this the case? Perhaps American Jewish veterans were weary after their service in World War II. Perhaps they were concerned about the illegality of fighting for a foreign power, or cosseted by protective Jewish parents. But the same was true for Jews elsewhere in the world. Canadian and South African Jews were far more likely, though, to have been involved in pioneering youth movements and to have a familial connection with the Yishuv. Some 15% of the Machal, a great many of them South Africans, stayed in the country after the war. So American Jews were less connected with Palestine than elsewhere in the diaspora. Its Zionism was more likely to be philanthropic, and yet it was precisely these donations that made possible Israel's victory in 1948. So to conclude, the Zionist project aspired to negate the diaspora. It would establish a sovereign state in the ancient Jewish homeland, or at least such was the clear goal by the Second World War. In classic Zionist ideology, a people that had survived across the ages thanks to its utility as merchants or financiers would now make their living by the sweat of their brow. Jews would no longer live at the whim of their host societies, enduring prejudice and persecution. They would determine their own fate, and they would develop the military means to do so. But the state of Israel did not give birth to itself. It was as much a continuation as it was the antithesis of diaspora. The institutional structures in the diaspora that generated the funds that sustained Israel in 1948 were not new. They were the same business and social networks that throughout modern history had brought Jewish activists together to engage in welfare activity on various levels. The United Jewish Appeal grew directly out of a long tradition of bureaucratized philanthropy that Jews in the West had developed since the late 1800s. This dense network of Jewish philanthropies consistently provided higher levels of aid than those provided by, say, municipal charities. During the First World War and the interwar period, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee dispersed over $100 million for relief and reconstruction to Jewish refugees in Europe and Palestine. During the Second World War, the Joint raised an additional $70 million. Is it no surprise, or is it any surprise, that in the wake of the Holocaust, American Jews would reach more deeply into their pockets than ever before and surpass their already remarkable levels of charitable giving? So you have many factors here. You have the cohesiveness of the American Jewish community, you have relative prosperity, you have growing sympathy for Zionism throughout the 1930s, and then you have the Holocaust, the catastrophe that destroys 2/3 of the Jews of Europe and compels this massive outpouring of aid. So in some ways then, placing this story in the framework of 20th century struggles for national liberation highlights the uniqueness of Israel's creation. Israel aspired to liberate the Jews not by overthrowing their oppressors in the Jews' lands of residence, but by engineering a mass immigration of Jews to a distant land that was ruled by a foreign imperial authority and inhabited by an indigenous people with a national consciousness of its own. For the Zionists, liberation came at the expense of not only the Ottomans or the British Mandatory Regime, but also the Palestinian Arabs. In order to achieve collective liberation, the Zionists engaged in decades of nation building. They constructed political and economic institutions of such strength and flexibility as to be able to withstand the assaults of 1948. Relying on their own resources and those of diaspora Jews, the Zionist leadership successfully created the preconditions for the State of Israel's existence. And yet, our comparative approach also normalizes the Zionist project as having been steeped in the Promethean spirit of the 20th century. It drew energy from and generated the revolutionary torque that overthrew tyrannical regimes, expelled colonial masters, and created new states throughout the world. Like other Promethean projects of the last century, Zionism could display hubris and cruelty, but it could also display an unshakable faith in humanity's capacity to re-engineer itself. Some historians of the 1948 war have described the Yishuv as a well-oiled machine that aligned its entire population into a dedicated fighting force. Such descriptions are exaggerated, but moreover, they overlook the fact that other national liberation movements, such as the FLN or the Viet Minh, were also highly successful at organizing the extraction of revenue and resources from the population and developing an effective fighting force. Compared with the Arab world, Israel in 1948 was indeed exceptional. When observed on a global level, however, Zionism's resemblance to independence movements in the era of post-war decolonization becomes apparent, not only in design, but also in method. Thank you.